Helen Mays never expected to be sitting in a law office surrounded by people wearing designer clothes and judgmental expressions. She was used to quiet mornings in her little flat, feeding the stray cats that wandered near her back door and making tea with the same chipped mug she'd had for 20 years. But that morning, everything was different. A week ago, a thick cream-colored envelope had arrived in her mailbox. Her name was written in neat, careful handwriting. Inside was a formal invitation to attend the reading of Charles Whitmore's will. She'd read it twice, then a third time, just to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. Mr. Whitmore? The same man she used to work for as a housekeeper over 15 years ago? Helen had been with the Whitmore family for nearly a decade. She cooked, cleaned, and sometimes just sat and listened when Mr. Whitmore had no one else to talk to, after his wife died. He had grown quiet, more withdrawn. Most people avoided him, but Helen always made sure his tea was warm and that he ate something, even if it was just toast and jam. After she left the job, they lost contact. She never thought he'd remember her, let alone include her in something as serious as his will. So, here she was, dressed in a simple blue cardigan, the same one she wore to church on Sundays, and black shoes that had been polished with care the night before. She clutched her worn leather handbag in her lap as she sat quietly in a large room filled with expensive furniture and heavy curtains. The other people in the room looked like they belonged in a magazine. Gold watches, high heels, perfectly done, hair. They chatted in low voices, glancing at her occasionally, their smiles tight and forced. Helen didn't recognize any of them, but she could tell they all knew each other, and none of them could figure out what she was doing there. Who? Is she? One woman whispered to another, pretending to check her nails. Probably a former maid, came the soft reply. Or the gardener's cousin or something. Helen heard it, but she didn't react. She wasn't there to argue or explain herself. She didn't even know why she'd been invited. She just thought it would be respectful to come. A tall man, with a briefcase, entered the room and cleared his throat. Everyone turned to look at him. "Good morning," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I'm Mr. Harrison, Mr. Whitmore's lawyer. Thank you all for being here." Helen's heart began to beat a little faster. She folded her hands tightly in her lap and looked down at her shoes. Whatever was about to happen, she hoped it would be quick and quiet. She had no idea that her entire life was about to change. The room was too quiet for Helen's liking. The kind of silence where whispers felt loud and every small sound echoed. She stayed in her corner seat, back straight, eyes on the floor. She didn't want to draw attention, but it was already too late. People had noticed her the moment she walked in. A young woman across the room leaned close to the man beside her and muttered something behind her hand. They both laughed under their breath. Another woman, older and dressed in a bright red suit, gave Helen a long, puzzled look before turning to the person next to her. "She's not family," she whispered, not as quietly as she thought. "Maybe she's here for the housekeeping money." Helen felt her cheeks warm. She knew they were. Talking about her. The glances, the whispers, the smirks. It wasn't hard to figure out. Still, she sat calmly, pretending not to hear a word. She had dealt with worse before. People had always judged her for being quiet, for not having fancy things, for just being simple. A tall man near the fireplace crossed his arms and stared at her openly. "Who even invites the help to a will reading?" He said to no one in particular, just loud enough for the room to catch it. Someone else chuckled. "Maybe she found a coin under the couch and thinks she gets a share." Helen blinked slowly and took a deep breath. She didn't come for money. She didn't even think she would be mentioned. When the letter arrived, she thought it was a mistake. But something in her heart had told her to go. Maybe out of respect. Maybe curiosity. Or maybe because part of her missed the man who once, even in his grumpiest moods, had always thanked her for a well-made cup of tea. A man bumped her chair while walking by and didn't say sorry. Another woman brushed past her, giving her a cold look like Helen had stepped into a place she didn't belong. Everyone else was dressed in rich colors and shiny shoes. Helen wore a soft gray skirt and an old brooch shaped like a daisy, a gift from her sister years ago. Everything about her said she was out of place. Still, she stayed. Quiet, steady, with hands folded gently on her lap. She remembered how Charles Whitmore had once told her that the house felt less lonely when she was around. He'd said it in a low voice, almost like he was embarrassed to admit it. That memory gave her a little strength. The lawyer was still arranging papers on the large oak desk. The room buzzed with quiet gossip and impatient sighs. Helen didn't say a word, but inside she wondered the same thing as everyone else. Why had she been invited? Whatever the reason, she knew one thing. She would sit through it with grace, even if the others thought she didn't belong. The room finally settled down when Mr. Harrison cleared his throat for a second time. The whispers stopped. The rustling of coats and handbags quieted. Everyone turned their attention to the man behind the large wooden desk, waiting for him to begin. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice calm and clear. "We are here today for the official reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Charles Whitmore." Helen looked up for the first time since she'd arrived. Her hands were still folded tightly in her lap, but she listened carefully. Mr. Harrison flipped open a thick folder and pulled out a few papers. He adjusted his glasses and gave the group a small nod. "Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this will was signed and witnessed under proper legal conditions," he said, looking directly at a man who had already begun frowning. "All questions or concerns can be addressed after the reading." There were a few nods around the room, though some looked more annoyed than patient. Mr. Harrison began listing names. "To Thomas Whitmore, his nephew, Mr. Whitmore leaves the antique pocket watch passed down from his grandfather. To Martha Gregory, his cousin, he leaves the first edition books from his private library." Each name brought a small smile or nod from someone in the room. A few people murmured to each other quietly, already thinking of what they might do with what they received. Helen stayed silent. Her name hadn't come up, and she didn't expect it to. "To Olivia Whitmore," Mr. Harrison continued, "his niece, he leaves the painting of Lake Garda from his study." Olivia raised her eyebrows and looked unimpressed. "Just the painting?" she muttered under her breath, though not quietly enough. Her mother gave her a sharp nudge. Mr. Harrison went on, reading a few more small items. A set of golf clubs, a silver tea set, some stock certificates. Helen could feel the tension in the room growing. People were waiting for the big moment. The house, the cars, the money. That's what they were here for. "And now," the lawyer said, carefully turning the page, "we come to the remainder of Mr. Whitmore's estate." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. People sat up straighter. One man even leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, ready to hear his name. "Mr. Whitmore has left the rest of his assets, including his home, investment accounts, and all remaining property to one person," Mr. Harrison said, pausing for just a moment. "He names Helen Mays as the sole beneficiary." Silence. Not a breath. Helen froze. Someone gasped. She blinked, thinking she'd heard wrong. Her name. It didn't make sense. "Who?" someone asked sharply. Mr. Harrison repeated clearly, "Helen Mays." The quiet turned into a storm of confused voices. Helen sat still, heart pounding, unable to speak as the room erupted around her. The room felt like it exploded all at once. Voices rose, some sharp, some confused, others angry. Helen sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Her name, the simple woman everyone barely noticed, was the one who would inherit everything. "This has to be a mistake," a woman in a bright red dress shouted, standing up quickly. It was Olivia, the niece who had whispered about Helen earlier. "How can Helen Mays possibly get the entire fortune? She's not even family." Other relatives started nodding, their faces red with frustration. A man in a dark suit crossed his arms and said loudly, "Mr. Harrison, are you sure you read that correctly? Is this some kind of joke?" Mr. Harrison held up a hand, asking for calm, but the room only got louder. Some family members stood and began pacing. Others whispered angrily among themselves, clearly upset and not ready to accept what the will said. Helen felt like she was outside her own body, watching everything happen. People who barely knew her were shouting and complaining, but she didn't have the words to explain. She wanted to say something, to tell them she didn't expect this, but her voice was stuck. "Why her?" a man asked, pointing at Helen. "What did she do that any of us didn't?" Helen remembered the years she spent quietly caring for Mr. Whitmore, the nights she stayed by his side when he was sick, the times she made sure he wasn't alone. No one else had done that, but saying it now felt strange. Who would listen? Olivia stormed closer to Helen, sneering. "You're nothing but a housekeeper. This isn't right." Helen looked up and met Olivia's eyes. There was no anger, only calm. "I'm not here to fight," she said softly. "I'm just here because I was invited." Some relatives gasped at Helen's quiet strength. Others frowned, unable to believe she could stand there so calmly while their world was shaking. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat again. The will was signed and witnessed legally. Mr. Whitmore clearly stated his wishes. If anyone has concerns, they may seek legal advice, but the documents are final. The family's outrage didn't fade, but a few people slowly sank back into their chairs. They realized this wasn't going to be easy to change. Helen stayed still, her heart racing. She didn't want the fortune. She never had, but somehow she had been chosen, and she would have to face whatever came next. Outside the quiet lawyer's office, she thought about the man who had trusted her, the man who had seen her when no one else did. Maybe this was his way of saying, "Thank you." A thank you Helen never expected but would never forget. The anger in the room didn't settle after the announcement. Instead, it grew louder, sharper, and harder to ignore. Olivia stood up again, her face red with fury. "This can't be real! He couldn't have meant it!" she shouted, pointing at Helen. "Why would Charles leave everything to her? It's a joke." Others joined in, voices rising all at once. Some called Helen a liar. Others said, "The will must be fake." The man in the dark suit slammed his fist on the table and said, "We will fight this. We won't let some housekeeper walk away with everything." Helen kept her head low. She wasn't used to being shouted at, especially by strangers, but she had expected this reaction. Deep down, she knew the family wouldn't accept the decision easily. Mr. Harrison stood calmly, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. "Please, everyone," he said. "The will was signed just 2 months ago with all proper witnesses. It is legally binding." "But why?" a voice asked from the back. "Why her? Not a single one of us got the main inheritance. This isn't fair." "Mr. Whitmore made his choice," Mr. Harrison answered. "He was very clear." The lawyer pulled out a sealed envelope and held it up. "I have here a letter from Mr. Whitmore addressed to Helen Mays. Perhaps it will explain his wishes." Olivia's eyes narrowed. What kind of explanation could there be? It doesn't change anything. The room quieted enough for Mr. Harrison to open the letter. He read slowly, his voice steady. "Dear Helen, when I was at my lowest, you were the only one who treated me with kindness and respect. You cared for me without asking for anything in return. Your presence brought me peace and comfort. For that, I am forever grateful. This is my way of saying thank you. Charles Whitmore." Helen listened to the words, feeling a strange mix of sadness and gratitude. She remembered those hard days when Charles was sick and alone, how she had stayed late to make sure he was okay. No one else had. A few family members looked stunned. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances. The anger in the room shifted into something quieter, but it didn't disappear. Olivia stormed out, muttering, "This isn't over!" Others stayed behind, whispering plans about lawyers and challenges. But Helen knew she couldn't change the past or what Charles had decided. The room slowly emptied. Helen stayed seated, a little longer, trying to make sense of everything. She never wanted the fortune, but now that it was hers, she had to figure out what to do next. Outside the door, she heard snide comments and doubtful voices, but she kept her head high. Whatever happened, she would face it quietly, with the same kindness and patience she had always shown. After the crowd slowly left the room, the air still heavy with tension, Mr. Harrison approached Helen. "Would you mind staying for a moment?" he asked kindly. Helen nodded, folding her hands in her lap. She felt tired but curious. The lawyer led her to a small office nearby, quiet and filled with books. He closed the door behind them and sat at his desk. "Mr. Whitmore left this letter for you," he said, handing her a sealed envelope with her name on it in Charles's handwriting. Helen's fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. She unfolded the paper and began to read. "Dear Helen, you have no idea how much your kindness meant to me during the hardest time of my life. When I was alone and sick, you were the only person who treated me like a human being, not a patient or an employee. Your warmth gave me comfort and hope. I want you to know that your care did not go unnoticed. This inheritance is my way of saying thank you. With gratitude, Charles Whitmore." Helen's eyes filled with tears. She remembered those long nights when she sat by Charles's bedside, reading to him softly or just holding his hand. She hadn't done it for money or thanks. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. "He always said I was kind," Helen whispered. "But I never imagined this." Mr. Harrison nodded. "He wanted to reward you in a way that mattered. No one else was there for him like you were. It was a deeply personal decision." Helen thought about the family members who had mocked her, the angry voices and cold looks. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the quiet moments she shared with Charles, the small acts of care no one else saw. "What should I do now?" she asked softly. "Take your time," Mr. Harrison replied. "There's no rush. You have every right to the estate, but you don't have to decide anything immediately. I'll be here to help if you need." Helen smiled faintly. It was strange to think her life had changed so suddenly, but she felt ready to face it. "Thank you," she said, standing up. "For everything." As she left the office, Helen felt a calm she hadn't known before. She wasn't just a simple woman anymore. She was someone who had been seen, truly seen and valued. The fortune wasn't just about money. It was about kindness, respect, and the quiet power of caring for others, even when no one was watching. Helen walked out of the law office into the bright sunlight, feeling a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The heavy weight of the will reading still hung in the air, but now it felt softer, less like a battle and more like a quiet turning point. She paused on the sidewalk, looking around at the busy street. People hurried by, caught up in their own lives, unaware of the change in hers. Helen didn't want attention or headlines. She just wanted peace. For years, she had lived a simple life. Content with small joys, a warm cup of tea, a friendly smile, the soft purring of cats at her feet. She thought about how Charles had once told her the house felt less empty when she was there, how her kindness had given him comfort in dark days. Now, with the fortune unexpectedly hers, Helen realized that money wouldn't change who she was. It couldn't buy the quiet strength she had found in caring for someone when they needed it most. She remembered the late nights by Charles's bedside, the gentle conversations, the moments when she made him laugh even when he felt tired and weak. Those memories filled her with a gentle warmth. Helen thought about the family members who had shouted and judged her. She felt sorry for them. They missed something important: the power of simple kindness, the value of being there when it counts. Instead of feeling angry or proud, Helen felt grateful. Grateful that Charles had seen her for who she was. Grateful that her quiet life had mattered in a way she never imagined. She decided she would take things slowly. The fortune was a responsibility, but it was also a gift. She would use it to help others, especially those who, like Charles once was, needed kindness and care. Helen planned to donate to charities that supported the elderly and the sick. She thought about finding a small cottage by the sea where she could rest and welcome old friends for visits. She wanted to live a life that honored the quiet love she had given and received. When reporters called, eager for stories about the unexpected heiress, Helen spoke simply and honestly. "I didn't do anything special," she said. "I just cared." Her words touched many people. Some were surprised that a woman so humble could inherit such wealth. Others saw in her a reminder that kindness is more valuable than money. As the days passed, Helen found peace in her new life. The fortune was there, but it didn't change her heart. She was still the simple woman who loved quietly and deeply, and that, Helen knew, was the greatest inheritance of all. The days after the will reading passed quietly, but Helen's life was already changing in small, meaningful ways. She wasn't rich in the way most people thought. She didn't buy fancy clothes or flashy cars. Instead, she took her time learning what the inheritance really meant. Her first step was to visit the Whitmore house. It was a big old place, full of memories and silence. Helen walked through the empty rooms, feeling the echoes of the past. It wasn't just a house to her. It was a place where she had shared quiet moments with Charles, where she had cared for someone who needed her. She started making plans to fix the house, not for herself, but so it could become a place for others. She wanted it to be a small shelter, a warm home for elderly people who had no one else. Helen thought about how lonely Charles had been, and she didn't want others to feel that way. People around town were surprised when they heard about her plans. Some smiled, some shook their heads. But Helen didn't mind. She was used to quiet work, the kind that doesn't make noise but makes a difference. She hired a few helpers to clean and repair the house. She didn't want to do it alone, but she made sure everything was done carefully. The garden was overgrown, but Helen loved the idea of planting flowers and vegetables there again. One afternoon, as she was planting seeds in the garden, a neighbor stopped by. He was an older man named George, who had lost his wife recently. "I heard about what you're doing," he said softly. "It's a good thing." Helen smiled. "It's what Charles would have wanted." George nodded and stayed for tea. They talked quietly, sharing stories about people they had cared for. Helen realized she wasn't alone. There were others who understood the power of simple kindness. Letters began arriving, too. Thank you notes from people who had received help, invitations to community events, even offers from charities asking if she wanted to join their boards. Helen took it all slowly, always remembering that she was just a woman who had done what felt right. One day, she found herself sitting on the porch, watching the sun set. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from being ignored and mocked to becoming someone who could help others in a real way. Her life was quiet, yes, but full of purpose, respect, and hope. Helen smiled to herself. The fortune wasn't just money. It was a new beginning, a chance to show that kindness and care are the true riches in life. And so, with a peaceful heart, Helen stepped into her new life, ready to live it on her own simple, beautiful terms.